AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers, and today I have a really interesting set of guests. Joining me again as co-host and conducting the interview is Jennifer Daniel. She had a 37-year career with the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, serving in a variety of senior positions. She has a bachelor's degree from the University of Massachusetts in political science. And I'm very pleased to say she is a highly productive member of the AFIO board. Jennifer, welcome back to AFIO Now.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here. And I'm really excited today because we have someone who has been a fabulous colleague of mine in some of my final years in the intelligence community, Major General Charlie Cleveland. So Charlie, welcome. It's good to have you today.
Jennifer, thanks so much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this. And thanks for what you're both doing, really, to keep this momentum going with the organization.
Thanks. So for those of you who don't know Charlie, he is retired. He has over 34 years of experience in Army joint operations and the intelligence community. He has served in multiple war zones and foreign posts. In fact, we discovered in our pre-interview chat that he and Jim have served in some of the same places and know some of the same people. So we might have to have some extra recording at the end here so they can chat about that. Charlie has had 7 combat tours to Iraq and Afghanistan, and he's deployed operationally with intelligence community partners in many areas of the world. But I want to specifically ask him about his time in Latin America and Southwest Asia. Charlie was the Vice J2 for the Joint Staff when General Mattis was Secretary of Defense. He's also served as a spokesperson for NATO and U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Charlie's, I will say, final assignment in the intelligence community as an Army officer was as the Director of Operations, and he was also the Military Deputy Director for the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency. So, Charlie, I'm going to go ahead and give you your first question. You've had extensive experience working on joint operations between the military and national intelligence agencies. Can you talk to us about what issues or topics you worked across the Title 10 and Title 50 entities? And as you talk to that, can you provide us with an example of a successful effort that you're proud of? And what differences did you see in the cultures between the military and the national agencies?
Great. Yeah, thank you so much again, Jennifer. And it's a great starting point question. Just for initial context, first off, I feel very fortunate that I've had the opportunity to work in both the Title 10 world with the military at the tactical level, as well as with the Title 50 world in the intelligence community. And in many instances, I found myself as a bit of a bridge between the two. In the 1990s, as a younger officer, I found myself in an Army SIGINT special operations kind of tactical unit that was doing some very tactical level signals intelligence, but we were working directly for the National Security Agency. And so all of our requirements were coming directly from the National Security Agency, which provided some insight into that organization and the way that the agency really conducts signals intelligence. Because a lot of those were often overseas deployments, though, there was a lot of day-to-day interaction with the senior intelligence officer in country, so the chief of station, and the opportunity to learn from multiple chiefs throughout the world while conducting these very tactical SIGINT operations. So again, it was, as a starting point, it was a wonderful place for a younger officer to see the baseline where the rubber meets the road for the intelligence community when it comes to collection. As a mid-level officer, really after 9/11, I found myself working in a variety of different joint interagency task forces. Some of those were based in military places, Bagram, Afghanistan, for example, where we were very lucky to have officers from the CIA, from NGA, and of course, at that time, NGA was brand new, but also from NSA as part of these larger joint interagency task forces focusing on Al Qaeda. And then in turn, I was on more than one occasion detailed back into the CIA to represent military and Title X interests at either agency headquarters or at some of the various posts and stations overseas. And then finally, as you mentioned from the outset, my final assignment in the military was as the Director of Operations for NGA. And just for me, a very fascinating place to conclude my career, really at the strategic level. And so NGA, of course, is a Department of Defense agency focused on support to the combatant commands, but it's also a part of the intelligence community and resourced almost entirely by the intelligence community. And so for me, it was just a fascinating nexus between the Title 50 and the Title 10 worlds to be able to really see how those agencies function and how they operate at the strategic level. To your question about examples where there were successful bilateral operations, for lack of a better term, I'm very pleased to say I feel like almost everything that I was a part of after 9/11 fell into that category. And it started off, I would say, primarily from a targeting standpoint. So we had very shared interests with the Title 50 community in developing targets. And as I think through the entire continuum of a targeting cycle of kind of finding and fixing and frankly actioning the target and then exploiting, the intelligence community was a direct part of every bit of that. And so the ability to use national level capabilities in direct support of young soldiers and special operators who were going onto a target, we found to be really the appropriate mix that worked consistently and on every occasion. Where I found it to be particularly impactful was on very strategic missions. And so some of the missions to capture or kill some of the senior Al-Qaeda leadership, subsequently some of the senior ISIS leadership, I found that the back and forth between the intelligence community and the Department of Defense and the military was very, very effective. And again, the military, I believe, would not have been able to do what it was able to do without national intelligence support. And I also believe that the national intelligence community benefited directly from having direct support from the special operations community, whether it was bringing in additional information or helping with analysis or providing extra emphasis on what our intelligence community partners were after. You mentioned the cultural aspect. And again, I feel very fortunate in that I had the opportunity to again observe the military through the eyes of, frankly, the CIA or NSA or NGA. And then I at times had the opportunity to view CIA, NGA, and NSA in particular through the eyes of the military. And I found it was a great vantage point to be able to learn about both of those cultures. More specifically, I would tell you, I found that the intelligence community was very agile, very quick to be able to turn on a problem. They were able to dispense with bureaucracy, and they were able to immediately focus on very important missions and bring to bear the appropriate resources. Culturally, though, I found that the military was usually a little bit more attuned to longer term planning and to being able to bring a number of resources in to support those operations, the big muscle movements that come with the military. And again, I think there was a role, an absolute role for both of those capabilities to be employed and applied, particularly during the war on terror. I say all that, and of course, it wasn't always perfect, and there were certainly disagreements. I find that members of the intelligence community have type A personalities, just as members of the military do. And just as we have disagreements within our own organizations, whether it's within NGA or within CIA or within the various military units, you do often find that there can be some very strong personalities that will disagree on how best to accomplish a mission. And I found that it really does take a very deft touch to be able to maneuver in both the IC and in the military world to keep everybody focused on what's the most important thing is conducting those missions. Where I found there to be an absolute nexus again between the two, though, is both the intelligence community and the military are blessed with a number of very, very committed people. And so even though it manifests differently and maybe the haircuts are different and what you wear to work every day is a little different and maybe the way you approach a problem is different, at the end of the day, what I found is a very common thread between both, which is people who are genuinely committed to the mission and dedicated to those around them to be able to help them out and to be able to support the larger mission. So by and large, Jennifer, I found I just feel very fortunate in having had the opportunity to serve both in the military, but then also as a member of the intelligence community, either directly detailed or in direct support of a number of operations that the IC is conducting.
Thanks, Charlie. I think that's a really good explanation of the differences that you saw. And what it seems to me is that as you work together, you were able to both understand each other, but then bring those national assets together with the tactical assets in order to achieve success in stopping the terrorists back where they were in their own countries and not here in the U.S. so that we didn't have another attack like a 9/11. That'd be a good way to quickly summarize it.
Absolutely. I think I guess I kind of view it through the lens of mission first, which is the combination of the capabilities of the intelligence community and the military. I believe we're very successful throughout Afghanistan, throughout Iraq, and frankly, throughout many other locations around the world. And then the other aspect I found to be very important was when you're working on a small forward operating base together with your intelligence community counterparts, what I found is those relationships become very deep. And as you transition back into the Beltway, those relationships established in very difficult conditions paid huge dividends for working together at the strategic level and at the agency level. And I found, even again in my last position at NGA with you, I found it very easy to reach out to the CIA and to the NSA and talk to colleagues with whom I'd served for many, many years in some difficult locations. And we were able to cut through challenges and accomplish an awful lot.
So red tape and bureaucracy didn't stand in the way of getting the job done and accomplishing the mission that we need to accomplish in order to keep our nation safe.
Yes.
Now, early on, you said after 9/11, you were focused on counterterrorism. Before that, were you focused on counter-narcotics?
I was. Again, I found myself at an organization that was doing a bit of tactical SIGINT. And of course, the number of collection resources and capabilities in the 90s significantly limited to what we have today. And so in many instances, what I found myself fortunate enough to do was to use some very tactical SIGINT capability on behalf of the NSA, but in many ways working to directly support a country team overseas. And as many remember, of course, particularly in the early 90s, a big focus on the war on drugs and counter narcotics. And that, of course, continued later into the 90s, even as the tragedy of the Balkans was unfolding. There was still an awful lot of work to be done in the Counter Narcotics Center, as well as, with the various divisions that were supporting that.
Great. Thanks, Charlie. I'm going to move on to another time in your career, and that is when you were the Vice J2 for the Joint Staff and working with General Mattis. Can you tell us what it was like to work there? I imagine it was very fast-paced and intense.
It was very fast paced and intense. And those positions typically are. Of course, it was an exciting time with Secretary Mattis, and Chairman Dunford was the chairman at the time. And again, it's just a step back and a quick overview. The role, as I think you both know, but some of the others may not be quite as clear, the role of the J2 at the Joint Staff or at the Combatant Command is kind of twofold. But at the Joint Staff, it's first off to provide all of the necessary intelligence support to the chairman, as well as to the Secretary of Defense. And then the second role is really to work to integrate the various intelligence activities of the combatant commands, to integrate them into a larger picture that, again, supports the direction of the Secretary in particular. And so as you look across the breadth of what the J2 on the Joint Staff is responsible for, first off, is as benign as it sounds, there's a human resources aspect of being able to manage soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines from 4 different services, civilians from the DIA, contractors, and then an interagency contingent. So there comes with the typical management of what is the largest staff section on the Joint Staff of about 800 people. There's a current ops or a current intel section, which is responsible for the day-to-day production, works very, very closely with the CIA and with other components of the intelligence community to bring in the most current analysis to provide to the secretary and to the chairman. There's an aspect that's working current operations. And so working with the Joint Staff J3 and the Joint Staff J4 to provide direct support to their needs. There's an aspect of targeting. And of course, there's a very strong piece of connective tissue between military targeting and the intelligence community as you do what's referred to as deliberate targeting, where you have the opportunity to really spend some time on a target and really analyze and observe it and plan the fires. All of that is vetted through the intelligence community as well. And the Joint Staff becomes the interlocutor into the intelligence community to confirm that those targets are what the military thinks they are and to confirm that there will be no equities damaged by striking those targets. There's an aspect of collection management that's involved as well. And of course, there's not only the tactical control of military collection capabilities, but that becomes the conduit into requesting tasking from, again, NGA and Imagery, requesting tasking from NSA and SIGINT. And so there's an aspect of managing and balancing every bit of that. And so within the Joint Staff J2, that is really the effort is to control that and in many ways to, again, serve as a bit of a bridge into the intelligence community to assist with collection management, collection orchestration, to assist with targeting support, to assist with current intelligence support, and then to also make it a bilateral relationship, again, where we're able to assist the intelligence community on all of that. Although you didn't quite ask it, I would tell you I found that both Secretary Mattis and General Dunford were tremendous consumers of intelligence. They were both very well educated on the intelligence community and the capabilities, as well as some of the limitations of the intelligence community. But they were also very dependent on the work that was coming out of the Title 50 world. And they were also very grateful for those relationships. And so they were demanding customers, but they were well-informed customers. And they did have high expectations for everybody. And so it was a really good relationship with them. And then, as I mentioned earlier, and I brushed over it a little quickly, but again, there are representatives from each of the national agencies that have elements that are based in the Pentagon that are there to provide direct support into the Joint Staff as well. And so NSA, CIA, and NGA in particular all have components that bring their expertise and bring their capabilities into the discussion and are able to provide that direct support. So yeah, it's a grind. As we know, the world never stops turning. There is always a drama. The day as the vice would typically start about 3:30 in the morning as we prepared the slides that would go into the chairman and the secretary for their morning intel brief, and it would proceed at pace throughout the day and throughout the weekends. And so it was busy. And as I think back on those times and I look at those who are doing it now with all the crises around the world, be it in Ukraine or the Middle East, and certainly preparing for China, I'm grateful for the work that they are doing and know that they are working some difficult hours.
Yeah, they definitely are working some difficult hours under very tight time constraints. But I do see, and I saw through my career, that there was quite a bit of joint operations and joint commitment to the mission once again. When you were there, what were some of the top issues that you were working?
Sure. I think the biggest issue, if you recall, I departed Afghanistan in the late spring of 2017 and arrived at the Joint Staff in the summer. And for me, having spent most of the preceding 20 years focused on counterterrorism and to a degree the Balkans and counter narcotics, what I really had to spend an awful lot of time relearning or learning about was Asia. And at that time, of course, was the beginnings of the pivot and the focus to China and strategic competition. But of course, what really popped up in the fall of 2017 were some very serious concerns with North Korea. And if, as everybody probably recalls, there was quite a bit of saber rattling at that point. Kim Jong-un was launching a number of missiles, and there was always the question of how is the United States going to respond. There was actual, real, serious discussion about deploying additional capability and capacity onto the peninsula. And what we found at that time at the Joint Staff level was trying to balance that crisis against the other responsibilities around the world. We still had, of course, forces in Afghanistan. We still had a threat from the Iranians. We still had forces certainly in Iraq and Syria. And trying to balance capability and capacity against the emerging need to be prepared and postured for the Korean Peninsula with what we already had going was very difficult. And so Secretary Mattis set us down a path of really going through each of what are referred to as operational plans or op plans, which are kind of the big strategic plans for how you engage and fight a war if provoked, trying to reconcile the resource requirements for Asia versus the resource requirements for Iran versus the resource requirements for other parts around the world really became a big part of our capability to integrate. At the intelligence level, of course, that had direct impact on the types of collection we could ask for. It had direct impact on what we requested of the national intelligence community and what we would have expected to see using our experiences, JD, from NGA, for example. How many analysts would be available to support a crisis on the peninsula? How much collection would be available to support a crisis on the peninsula? And how could we balance that against the other needs and requirements? So really, one of the big things that we focused on, of course, was trying to balance that out and focused on the DPRK. The second big area was, of course, there were some successes against ISIS during that time. There were some strategic raids against al-Baghdadi in particular that occurred during that time. So there was also a balance and the natural handoff between the intelligence community, who oftentimes was the lead for finding some of those key targets, and then passing that over to the military to execute the finish of those targets. And there was a lot of really great hand-in-glove work with the intelligence community on some of those really strategic targets during that period, where we were able to benefit from the capabilities that the IC had and their ability to really do strategic location of some very, very difficult targets, and then pass it over to the military to execute the finish operations. And so that was really the big area. And when I say that, it was Syria was still certainly on and the U.S. forces going after ISIS and the Kurdish forces going after ISIS. So that was really the other big topic that we had to spend a lot of time focused on.
Yeah, Charlie, those are big topics. There were no small issues when it came to any of those countries. I mean, trying to balance things between ISIS, North Korea, China, and China's activities around the world, that alone is enough, never mind Iraq and Afghanistan and everything else that was going on. So it was an interesting time, as they say.
Yes. Yes.
Now, another interesting time is when you and I were both assigned to NGA. You were there as the director for operations. And in this role, you were responsible for analysis and collection across all of our mission areas and the worldwide operations that NGA had going on. Now, I want to do a little bit of before you were the director of operations and then after you were the director of operations. And what did you know about GeoInt? So prior to becoming a senior executive or senior officer within NGA, how did you use GeoInt? And what did you think of GeoInt and its contribution to the overall intelligence picture?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I have thought about this topic 100 times since my experience at NGA. And I would tell you, before my assignment to NGA headquarters, I was always a consumer and a user of GeoInt. And I used GeoInt, as I thought back on it, on virtually everything that I did in the military. And it started off as a young officer, as we were discussing earlier, in the first Gulf War, really using maps and being responsible for the maps that we had and for supporting the operations of the infantry battalion that I was with. As a young Army Ranger, we were one of the few tactical units that had access to national level imagery. And we certainly used as much as we possibly could for every operation and mission we planned. And then after 9/11, as we all deployed forward, what I found is that GeoInt became integral to every single operation we conducted in all phases of it. It was absolutely critical in the planning of going onto a target. So again, the basics of understanding the map and understanding the terrain around a target, using national level capabilities to provide images of the objectives at various times of day with various profiles, using full motion video, which of course really came into its own during the War on Terror and the exploitation that was conducted by NGA and other GeoInters. And then even after the mission was over, as we would detain and hold detainees and go through the process of exploiting those, both the detainee themselves through interrogation, but also through the captured material that they may have had. It was very common for us to have GeoInters directly supporting those efforts, either using maps and having the detainees map track to other locations or showing them degraded images so that they could, again, point to the next target that we had to go through. And so, quite honestly, I found that GeoInt was a part of every single mission, and it was essentially included in just about every aspect of a mission to head onto a target to conduct a capture or kill operation. And so I found it to be integral. I say all that. I took NGA and I took GeoInt for granted. In many ways, I used to joke with others that NGA was always the no drama agency. We'd have a problem, we'd ask for it, and all of a sudden, boom, there produced was everything that we needed. And when we had a particularly tricky problem, we would try and describe and shape, hey, here's kind of what I'm looking for. Can you do something like this? Can you provide a little terrain elevation? And invariably, the NGA officers that were assigned to the task forces that I would come back with something even better than we had envisioned. And that new product then became the standard for the subsequent targets. And so it was a really righteous cycle of constantly having these products improve. But as I mentioned, I took it for granted, and I didn't fully appreciate just how difficult the work is and just how much art and science there is into what those GeoInters were providing. And so as I arrived at NGA, I'm embarrassed and not proud to admit the following, but I thought, how hard can it be? You look at an image, okay, I can see that's a tank. Yeah, no big deal. And of course, that was naive, and it was just plain ignorant. And what struck me as I really started to become a part of NGA was the breadth and the scope of the mission of NGA, and then the depth of expertise and how difficult the discipline of GeoInt really is. So when I think about the breadth and the scope, I'm not quite sure I ever put two and two together to realize that the old Defense Mapping Agency had been integrated into NGA and had become a part of everything that NGA was doing. And so the fact that NGA, I always associated NGA with imagery and imagery analysis. But what I didn't fully appreciate was that NGA is providing all of the nautical charts, both surface and subsurface, for the American Navy. They're providing safety navigation updates for really maritime capabilities all over the world. They're providing every aeronautical chart for every military aircraft. They're providing every ground map. And they're doing all of the geomatics to support GPS and everything else that we rely on so heartily today. And it was just stunning to me to see the number of PhDs that were working really the geospatial sciences to keep the GPS system in track. And then on the imagery side, again, I was just stunned to see the breadth of the mission, because I was very familiar with the work that NGA was doing to support targeting, to support longer range analysis. But what I didn't fully appreciate is NGA's work on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts. And so for whether it's hurricanes around the world or damage to U.S. infrastructure based on that, or whether it is ice melting at the North Pole, or whether it's 100 different similar things. I just had no idea that NGA was doing all that. And it really surprised me. And then going back to the depth of expertise, again, I naively thought, how hard can it be? You look at a picture, you got it. And of course, I very quickly learned that it's an incredibly difficult discipline, and the level of expertise to be able to understand the collection, to be able to understand the appropriate time to collect on a given target, given the positioning of the satellite, given weather, given light, given everything else, and then the ability to really interpret not only standard pictures, electro-optical, but also radar and a number of the other phenomenologies that now play a part of it. It really is graduate level work. And so to me, it was humbling to have the opportunity to be around so many people who were doing so many things that I had just taken for granted for so long, and the opportunity to have so many of them teach me about what it was that they were doing. So as you know, JD, but for others, again, I absolutely fell in love with the agency. I fell in love with the workforce. I fell in love with the culture, just a tremendous group of people who are doing extraordinary things, oftentimes not overly heralded, and they kind of like it that way, but it was just really a great opportunity to be a part of that community.
Thanks, Charlie. And it was fabulous to have you there, but I really like your characterization of the no drama agency. You asked for it and it was delivered, and it was better than what you had envisioned after just a rough outline. And I also think that it's a tribute to the people that before you got there, it was like, how hard can it be? And then after you got there, you found out how hard it really is and how easy they made it look. So if you can't tell, I am proud of the GeoInt profession and all of the different activities they have going on around the world and across various mission areas that people don't even quite understand. And I think GPS is one of those that you don't understand, that every time you pick up your phone and you try to find something, there's NGA is behind that and making sure that it's as accurate as it can be. So now that I've bragged about one of my former assignments and agencies, I'm going to move on to talk about the value of the sources that are open and unclassified now. So as I started and as you started, what we were dealing with was trying to compete for a scarce number of resources and trying to figure things out between the lines of what was released within the different media reports or unclassified reporting. Now, the world that we live in, there's an abundance of unclassified information. There's commercial imagery satellites and there's open source intelligence. You know, it's more of a challenge of how do you sort through all of this in order to get intelligence. So from your perspective, can you talk about the value of the commercial sources of intelligence, commercial imagery satellites, and the open source?
Sure. Again, I think that is the topic of the coming decade, and how best the intelligence community can effectively harness open source information as well as commercially available information that one purchases. And as you mentioned, I think the problem of the last several decades has been an overwhelming number of requirements and a limited number of collection capabilities. I think moving forward, that will no longer be the problem. I think the problem is absolutely going to be, how do you parse through this incredible amount of information to find the actual information that you're looking for and being able to apply it to your problem set. So when I think about the value of commercial imagery and other open source information, I really do think we're at the point where it's becoming, and it sounds cliche to say, but I think it's becoming invaluable. When I look at first off, on the commercial imagery standpoint, what we know is that the national constellation is always going to have some level of limitation. The national constellations, of course, were built to be very exquisite and provide some very, very incredibly detailed capabilities. But in many instances, analysts aren't going to need that. They're just going to need to have broader collection, and they're going to need to have persistence as opposed to, I think, very, very micro detailed collection. And I think first off, what the commercial capabilities provide is I think they provide that persistence. And so the ability, we're at the point now where commercial capabilities are imaging almost every place on the planet 24/7. And so the ability to tap into those resources and those databases to, again, cover areas that the national constellation can't cover, as well as to be able to do the historical comparison to look for whatever type of change has occurred, is exactly what the commercial imagery capabilities are going to provide. Increasingly, and JD, you know this better than I do, but obviously the capabilities that have been developed over the last decade from an EO standpoint are just really, really impressive. But increasingly, when I look at commercial radar and its use with the Ukraine target set, when I look at the other phenomenologies that will be out there, hyperspectral and multispectral capabilities, these are all things that are going to be available at the fingertips of an analyst at a given moment. So rather than going through a collection process where you're competing against other national priorities, I think there's going to be this democratization of this information that makes it available for every analyst to reach up and be able to service their own requirements, whether it's from EO, whether it's from radar, whether it's from multispectral types of capabilities. And so really do think moving forward, the ability to leverage and harness those capabilities to maintain persistent coverage over your target, to ensure that you're able to rapidly pick up those changes when your target moves from point A to point B and signals that something else has happened. I think really the commercial capabilities are going to, in many ways, not only supplement, but in some instances, they're going to provide the leading capability for it. On top of the actual pixels, I think there is real value in a lot of the analytic capabilities that are coming out of the commercial and the private sector. Obviously, there are only so many analysts at NGA who can focus on whatever the crisis of the day is. And so as you focus on the crisis of the day, where you really need those graduate level eyes and brains looking at a target, in many ways, there are other things that still have to be done. And so it may be the various crop growth in China. It may be the level of mining in Africa. It may be these other things that are a little bit longer lead time. And in some instances, there are probably commercial analytic capabilities that can provide some of that assistance as well. And then when I think about real world application of this, and this I think expands broader than just commercial imagery, but when I think about the use of open source, and I go back to the opening days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's not a secret at all, but there were a number of commercial capabilities that were utilized to help track Russians as they moved across Russia towards Ukraine, and then once they were on the battlefield in Ukraine. And in some of those instances, it was commercial imagery, but in other instances, it was Russian posts on Facebook or their equivalents of Facebook. It was press releases that were coming out of Ukraine or various places in Russia. There was a variety of different things that allowed the intelligence community to harness that open source information to be able to very specifically track down to unit level as the Russians were moving towards Ukraine and then conducting their invasion of Ukraine. And so when I think about how that is applied to future intelligence community problems, I think there are just so many lessons that can be learned from the use of commercial imagery, again, going back to the persistence and the change detection, down to using broader open source capabilities to help locate and understand what is happening at a given place on the planet.
So given all of that, what do you think some of the risks are to the intelligence profession and to our intelligence analysis? And I think often of the advent of AI, of artificial intelligence, where it can aid intelligence professionals in their job, but maybe there are people out there who could fool us.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it is a tremendous risk, Jennifer, and I think it is something that the intelligence community is also going to have to wrestle with, is this concept of, particularly in the geo world, assuring that those images that you are seeing off the commercial platforms are what we think they are. And so larger than just a deception capability on the ground, that of course, imagery deception has been around since well before World War II with inflatable machinery and tanks and all that type of stuff. But fundamentally ensuring that those pixels on that collection capability have not been manipulated, that they have not been manipulated as they come down to the ground. And so being able to assure that what you're seeing as an image is actually what is on the ground and is at the location that you expect it, I think becomes very critical. Obviously, we've now moved into an era of deepfakes. Those deepfakes can certainly apply to imagery and images of people. It can certainly apply to voices. It can really apply to a number of things. And so just as quickly as the intelligence community really harnesses and leverages commercial capability, I think there's got to be, and there are a number of efforts, but there's got to be a parallel effort to look for ways to be able to identify where the risk is and then how to mitigate that risk by determining, are those images what we think they are, and have they been manipulated? And so I think there is risk with that. I think culturally there's also always the risk too, where the goal of artificial intelligence and the goal of machine learning and the goal of these capabilities is really to free up the analysts so that they can really do only the things that humans can do, to some of the mundane capabilities and some of those tasks. That, of course, is the goal. And I think we also can run the risks, if we're not disciplined in our mid-level management, of just taking verbatim the answers that are spit out of a machine or the answers that come off of a commercial capability. And so I think always ensuring that our mid-level and junior analysts are looking with a very critical eye everything that's provided to them and questioning, as they should be, questioning what they're seeing and when they're seeing it. And so I think there's always the risk of frankly, getting a little intellectually lazy by having all of this provided to you. And I think we as leaders, and certainly the teams that are leading now, are going to really have to guard against that to ensure that there's always that extra level of rigor and scrutiny that's put into those products to ensure that they are what we think they are.
Thanks, Charlie. So one of my key takeaways from this is your words of doing only what humans can do is that critical analytic thinking, is looking beyond what you're seeing, beyond what you're hearing, to understand it, understand the implications, and to make sure that you are providing as accurate and objective intelligence as you can. Would you say that?
Yeah.
A characterization of what we need to make sure that we train our people to do?
I would. As always, I think you're more succinct and articulate than I am on that, Jennifer. And so, no, I think that summarizes it very, very well.
Thanks. So along that line, one of the things that we do within the Association of Former Intelligence Officers is how do we give back? How do we network and communicate among ourselves, but also what do we do with those who are interested in becoming intelligence professionals? Many of our members are professors and instructors at colleges and universities, and there are many of us who will provide a discussion about our careers or our experiences in order to help them understand what they're entering into, or even if they might be interested in it. What advice would you give to young people interested in joining us as intelligence professionals, either through the military or in a national agency?
Thanks. I just think that is such a great question, and I'm grateful for what you guys are doing to be able to really help grow the next generation of leaders. I think it's just absolutely important. I really have two macro pieces of advice for those that are considering going into the intelligence community. First macro piece of advice is absolutely do it. I have found there is just something very satisfying about service, and service to something bigger than yourself. And of course, service is not only military service, it's not only intelligence community service. There are a number of other ways to serve, whether it's in other parts of the government or even roles, of course, in the private sector. But bottom line is, I think even if you don't make a career of it, there is something very, very valuable and something very noble in serving something greater than yourself. As it pertains to the intelligence community, I just found it, quite honestly, to be exciting all the time. There was something that I found to be very addictive to being focused on international affairs and global events. and also kind of understanding things that nobody else was seeing or understanding. There's something about being in the intelligence community where you begin to view the world in a very different way. You see things in the news, you see things in others, you see things when you travel that normal American citizens probably are not going to pick up. And you start to view the world from a very different perspective when you see it through the lens of an intelligence officer. I think there's also something very appealing about, quite honestly, being in a position where you're contributing to our national security, but you're doing it in a very silent way. And you're doing it in a way that doesn't necessarily bring a lot of attention on yourself, but really focuses much more on the mission. So I always found, again, service starting off very important to me. Second off, I found service in the intelligence community particularly exciting just because you are in on something that only a few are able to do and only a few are aware of, and it changes your perspective on everywhere around you. And then the final component of that is they're just really interesting people in the intelligence community also. There's something about it that attracts some really unique personalities with tremendous backgrounds. And I just continue to always find some of the most interesting people that I've had the honor to know came from the intelligence community. The second macro piece of advice I would tell anybody who's thinking about is keep your expectations realistic and in check as well. At the end of the day, the intelligence community is a big community. It is a bureaucracy. It's not perfect. It makes mistakes. It has its share of people that you don't necessarily want to be around. And so fundamentally, as you go into it, you should expect that it is not Shangri-La, that there are challenges in the intelligence community and with those that get there. But combining that with the first part of it, I found that coming into the intelligence community, you come in and you're just really excited about it, and you're seeing behind the curtain and you're seeing this brand new world, and it's very exciting. And then one day you kind of hit a point where you go, hey, wait a minute, that's messed up and that doesn't make any sense. And this person isn't the James Bond I thought they were going to be. And once you get out of that, and once you realize that, hey, the place is not perfect, but it's pretty darn good, and it really provides a lot. To me, it becomes a very satisfying and very exciting organization to be a part of. Getting lost in some of the excitement, understanding it's not perfect, but marrying those two up to realize that, hey, it's a pretty darn good community and it's something to be proud of to serve.
So, Charlie, thank you for that. I think that your comments are right on. I think that it is a very satisfying and interesting career. I never had a dull moment, and each opportunity led to one that was just as interesting or maybe even more interesting. And the people and the bonds that you make along the way are incredible and are lasting. But I would also say that as they go through this, there is any number of things that they could do. You know, you yourself have done so many different things across your career, and I know that you're still very active in the private world. And so we appreciate you taking your time and spending it with us and giving us your thoughts and sharing with us your experiences. So thank you. I do really appreciate it. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jim, unless you have any final words for us.
The final words would be, again, my thanks. And on the key piece, when I think about the things that stay with me the most after a career in the intelligence community, it's those personal connections forged in shared hardships and difficult times and difficult locations. It's those relations and those bonds that really do stick with me, and also an enduring sense of pride of hopefully having contributed something to the greater good. So I appreciate the opportunity, Jennifer, and thanks for your time.
Thanks, Charlie. Jim, over to you.
Well, it's been a real privilege to listen in on this conversation. And I agree wholeheartedly with both our co-host and our guest today. The ability to serve, the shared relationships with incredible people really make for a wonderful career. So first of all, I want to thank both Jennifer Daniel and Charlie Cleveland for their service to the nation, but also for bringing to us today a really fascinating and educational presentation.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.